tax and what taxes are possible, then Jim Keddy is here to talk about cannabis. And we have with us Ben Gaverser, who I just met in person, although we've communicated a lot by email, who's from Olson Remshow law firm. And this is this is like the dream team, guys, of who can help us, figure out what legal options you have for putting a revenue measure on the ballot. And I don't want anybody to leave this session without getting an answer to their questions, because there is no question that you have that this group of people can't answer. So we're going to stay here till you get what you need out of this. And one of the reasons we're doing this as one of the early things is, I don't want people to start dreaming about what kind of thing they can do when it's not legal or not possible or doesn't make sense. So having some kind of revenue path that works in your city or county is really very important. Now, you don't have to decide now, are we going to do a sales tax? Are we going to do a cannabis tax? Are we going to do a set aside? But you have to know what's possible and what's not possible. So basically, just to give, can you see this now? Okay, good. And then you'll be able to see what's coming up. That's a good thing. So this is to give you just the biggest overview of how to get public dollars, because we're here talking about public dollars. And, it's all very exciting. It's also not easy. So you can reallocate existing dollars. That's like, hey, let's move money from the cops into youth development. Or you can allocate new dollars, which is like, oh, there's all this ARPA money coming. Let's make sure we get a bunch of it for kids. Or you can generate new dollars, which is a shorthand for taxes. Although there are a few ways, and I'm not going to go into them now, and I think maybe we should have another session on this, Ed. There are a few things you can do with fees and in-kind donations and community benefit agreements that are ways to generate new dollars, but we're here to talk about the ballot. So the three areas in which you can generate public dollars is the budget process, and we will have a separate session on the budget process. And if people want to have a training in how to be a kick-ass budget advocate for kids, write that in the chat now. Yeah, that'd be cool. I want to do that. But this is about using the ballot. And you can do a few things through the legislative process, very few, and this is about using the ballot. So when you're thinking about going to the ballot, you are looking at like, okay, what's the sweet spot between, what's politically possible, what your kids need, and basically what you're capable of doing. So just very quickly, and we're going to go through each of these. These are the things that you have to consider: the jurisdiction, what your legal revenue options are, what the goals of your measure, and the political and fiscal situation of your city or county. And these all will influence what kind of revenue stream you're going to want to go after. So the first thing I want to talk about, just for a second here, is what jurisdiction you're in or thinking about doing a measure in, because that has a significant influence on what's possible. So I put cities that have charters first, because they are the places with the most flexibility, because you can do all the kinds of taxes Ed is going to talk about, and you can do set-asides, and you can do business taxes. But not all cities have charters. They're called general law cities. If you don't know, Google it. Just Google California charter cities, and you'll see a list and see if you're on it. If you're a general law city, you can do all the taxes that Ed is going to talk about, but you can't do set-asides. We're looking at state legislation that might make it possible, aren't we, Ben? But you can't now. If you're in an unincorporated area, that's even more tricky. And, we talked to Coachella Valley about that. because a lot of their kids are in unincorporated areas, and then you start getting involved in what you can do at the county level, because you have to do a ballot measure through the county. So then there are charter counties, and they can do everything, a set aside. There's court cases pending, but we are advising people, you want to do a set aside in a charter county, you can, because we're expecting positive outcomes from the court cases. And but you can't do business taxes. Business taxes are city taxes. People are real upset about that. And you can have a general law county, as we had in Napa, and they put a set aside, they drafted it, and it would have taken us to the California Supreme Court to actually settle whether that's possible. Right now, we're telling people it's not possible. But we want people to think about school districts too, because school districts can put bonds on the ballot and they can put parcel taxes on the ballot. And that might be the answer for Coachella Valley. So now I'll talk about, so that's your jurisdiction. And sometimes I think, since you can do so much more at the city level, you're in a county, you might want to consider starting with the biggest city in your county and hoping that, it spreads, like San Jose in Santa Clara County, or there are other examples. And maybe it's the biggest city, and maybe it isn't the biggest city. Maybe it's like South San Francisco, which tried to do something in San Mateo County, and, to sort of get it to catch on in their county. So now I'm going to talk about, so that's jurisdiction. Now I'm going to talk about the difference between taxes and set-asides, because that's something you're also going to have to decide. And you don't have to decide right this minute, but you should know what you're walking into. And taxes, well, the public loves taxes. No, they don't. But actually, your legislative people like taxes, SEIU and public employee unions like taxes, because it generates more dollars and you don't have to start moving around existing dollars. So Ed is going to talk about all these taxes. And while a bond is not a tax, I put it on the list here too, because I know there are people online who are thinking about youth centers, and bonds are something you could conceivably put on for a youth center. But generally, when you're talking about taxes, you're talking about either special taxes or general taxes. And special taxes are what we all love, because those are the taxes that go specifically to what we want. It's going to childcare, it's going to youth, it's going to, the specific services we want targeted. And in just a second, I'll explain why that's a bit of a challenge, because there are also general taxes. And when you put a general tax on the ballot, which you can do, it goes into the general fund of your city or county. And a lot of people like, oh my God, if they get the money, they're never going to put it into what I want. But thanks to James Harrison at Olson Remcho, the soda tax in the Bay Area counties was done as a general tax. And he came up with an idea of how to make a general tax much more of a special tax by requiring an advisory committee that had only nutrition people on it. So there are some workarounds to the general tax idea. So then there is taxes. How do you get them on the ballot? Well, you can, a special tax requires a majority of the legislature. That would be your city council or your board of supervisors, and a general tax. And yes, we're going to, we're recording. We'll send you the slides, and Claudia's writing a summary, so you don't have to memorize this. I want to just give you an overview of knowing the considerations. A general tax requires 2/3 of your city council or board of supervisors to put on the ballot. Or there's another way to get on the ballot, which we are now favoring a lot, which is a voter initiative, which requires signatures. And we will have a whole session on how to do signature gathering, what's involved. We'll probably have a couple sessions because it's quite something. But at least at this point, you have to have 10 to 15% of the number of signatures as people voted in the last governor's election. And it depends on the kind of tax. I think charter amendments require 15%. Other things require 10%. That's a lot of signatures. So, but the big consideration, which leads people to figure out what to do, is what's the voter threshold for these things? So special taxes, which is what, we all dream about. I want a tax just for kids, requires a 2/3 vote. Unless, and here's the big thing that happened in recent years due to court cases, if you put your measure on the ballot by signatures, you can only require, it only requires a majority vote. So we did a set aside in San Francisco, the first one in the state, first children's fund. And we did it because it only required a majority vote. That was our major consideration. Excuse me, we put a set aside because it only required a majority vote. I'm getting a little, okay, I'm trying to go fast okay, so this is a set aside. And I want to say that most of the children's funds so far that have passed in California have been set asides. That means you either put something on the ballot or have your city council or board of supervisors put something on the ballot says we are going to dedicate a portion of our general fund or a portion of our cannabis tax or a portion of our property tax to kids. The voters love it because you can go around saying, oh, no new taxes. We're just going to use dollars that already exist in a way that reflects your priorities. And by the way, will make government more efficient. So this is everybody's favorite. I have to say, public employee unions hate it, hate it, hate it, because they say money's going to come out of police. It's going to come out of something that we're already working in. And legislators hate it too, because is the challenge is this feels like, oh, we're stealing somebody else's money. And the legislators say, oh my God, it's going to tie our hands. And we say, well, of course, that's why we're doing it. So it ties your hands to make you put to fund what we think you should fund. You see how happy these kids are in this picture. They're the young people from Richmond submitting their signatures to the city council. So, but there's no limit to how much you can set aside. Most people do 2 or 3%. In Pomona, they just finished their ballot measure, and they have done a contract to get signatures, and they're asking for 10% of the
Did you go on to that workshop?
What?
With Margaret?
That's the one coming up, right?
It said it came on at 12.
What is somebody talking?
No, let me join right now.
Okay, yeah, okay.
Hello.
Let me join.
Do I need to know something? Okay, so those are the kind of basics before Ed gets into sort of what specific taxes there are. But I want people to understand you make a decision about revenue in a broader context. How much money do you need? You want to fund childcare? It's very expensive. You're going to want more money. You want to just keep the ARPA stuff intact like they do in Humboldt. That's a much less money, and you can have a more modest revenue stream. You want to then look at public opinion. People will do the polling, surveys, etc., in order to see, well, what will people vote for? And then you want to look at, well, what else is going to be on the ballot? Oh, there's going to be a state tax on the ballot. Should we put it on or not? And I just, by the way, because this comes up in every single election, all our pollsters say, put it on the ballot anyway. People can't remember this, and they're not influenced by other things that are on the ballot. So, and then there's the economy of your city or your county and what And, you know, that affects what you will want to put on the ballot. This is an example of a poll, and it was done quite a while ago, and I only put it in here to remind me to tell you that we are in the process of doing a statewide poll, and we're going to be able to isolate various geographic parts of the state that can tell you which kinds of tax or revenue or set aside, you know, people will support in California and which parts of California. So we are in the process of preparing to do that, and that will be another tool you will have. And this is my last slide. And an additional tool that you will have is, you know, there are a lot of people you can sort of get their opinions from or get information from. I'll never forget the time I went with a group of advocates in Merced to go see the head of the, I can't remember what his title was, but he was the fiscal officer for the city. And I mean, he sat down, he opposed, of course, everything we were trying to do, but he had no problem sitting down with us saying, yeah, these are the possible taxes. These are the possible revenue things. This is what happened 5 years ago when we tried to do that. Here's the limitations on it. Here's the cap we've already met. So I really encourage people to use the staff people in their communities, especially if you are close to a member of the Board of Supervisors or city council member, who they also can get that information even more easily than advocates knocking on the door. So you can meet with election authorities, and you can pick the brains of all the campaign consultants and sponsors of previous measures who can say, yeah, we thought of that and we decided not to because of X, X, and X. Oh yeah, we tried the library, whatever, it didn't pass, and here's why. So I've gone very fast, and I hope people have gotten some of that, and we have taped it. And now I'm going to stop sharing, and I am going to turn to Ed and make him a co-host so that he can share his slides and, you know, sort of continue this. Are people getting it? I haven't been able to check the chat. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Ed. And oh, just by the way, Ed Harrington was the controller of San Francisco when our measure passed, but Ed, and he is a national expert in public finance. And we are just thrilled to have Ed on our side and on our team, because I can't think of anybody who knows more about this. And he is at everyone's disposal here, and he will look at your budget and say, oh, you know, this looks possible, this doesn't look possible, etc. Okay, go Ed.
Thanks, Margaret. Can everybody see what I'm looking at here? Great. So first thing is what makes a good tax. And there are good taxes and taxes that aren't as good. So obviously the first thing is it raises money. It needs to raise enough money. As Margaret said, it's great to have the tax that can pass, but if it doesn't get you the money you need, that doesn't make much difference. So you want to raise enough money to do what you want to do. It's relatively easy to comply with or calculate. And that's one reason people do a lot of sales taxes or things that are it just happens without a lot of trouble. Easy to administer, collect, and audit. You know, we were talking about, can we tax, you know, Google? It's like, oh my God, they're so much bigger than us. It won't be easy for us to collect it and audit them because they're such a crazy big thing. So things that you can actually audit and your tax collector can check and see that really the people are being honest about it. It should be viewed as equitable and fair. You know, when you go out and say this tax is going to really slam one group of people, obviously that's not a very popular thing for other people. It doesn't feel fair. They should be developed, if at all possible, through a very broad and effective process, which can also start to build your coalition. If you get out and talk to a lot of people and say, these are our options, what do you want to do? And people start to weigh in, they understand why you've chosen something and not something else. It only changes behavior if desired. So what I mean by that is if you go ahead and do a business tax on payroll and people therefore don't hire people, that's not the outcome you want. Taxes that give you a benefit for doing something like putting solar in your house changes behavior, but it's behavior changes that you want to have. The tax revenue is not volatile. It's hard to pick a tax and then have it bounce all over the place if you're trying to rely on that for daycare or for early childhood education, things that you need to have money every year. You don't want it to bounce around a whole lot. And it doesn't cause economic flight. You know, we pick sometimes hotel taxes because hotels really can't get up and walk away. But some other kind of businesses could move to a different city or move to a different place, and you don't want to do that. And just this is a reminder, good taxes can pass. You know, this is just from November of 2022. And look at school bonds, sales tax, parcel tax, hotel tax, cannabis taxes. So many of these passed. Now, in some cases, these are simply re-upping a previous tax that had a sunset on it. But some of these are new taxes. And so don't be at all discouraged. Taxes do pass in California quite often. So I want to go through the taxes in 3 different ways. And I'm doing big overview on these things with a lot of time, hopefully, for people to ask questions. So first, you know, an income revenue type of tax. A second kind of tax is a property related. And a third kind of tax would be transactional. So income, you can't have a local income tax in California. That's not possible because state legislation does not allow it. But you can have a business tax as long as it's not income based. And business taxes, many cities have a business registration fee, often a very small amount. It doesn't amount to very much money. But you can do a gross receipts tax or a payroll tax. And those can be all over the place. They can really be equitable kinds of things. They can be based on sales within a jurisdiction, lots of flexibility of the business types and size. The payroll tax can be the number of employees, gross salaries. Again, it has to be based on what's in your jurisdiction. And so the pros of business tax is that does not tax most voters directly. So that's usually a good thing for voters. It can address income inequality, and it can direct revenue to specific purposes. The cons are that if you really go after businesses, they can give you a well-funded opposition to your tax. If you do a payroll tax, they can say this is going to attack jobs. If you do a business tax, they can say this is going to attack small businesses. And the opposition arguments about a tax being passed to consumers is pretty intuitive. If someone says you tax us, we'll go ahead and raise our prices, people do kind of get that that's probably what's going to happen. One of the limits is that counties can only levy these things in unincorporated areas. So you can't go ahead and say, I want a business tax for my whole county and get a tax from all the businesses in the cities and the county. But there are all kinds of ways of doing it. We often give San Francisco as examples because we tax everything that walks. So, you know, we had a tax that we had on the ballot just in the last couple of years that taxes it has a surcharge for homeless purposes. And it taxes additional amounts on business gross receipts, and it raised over $50 million for homeless services. We have a tax on just commercial property. So just people that own buildings and rent them out. And that tax goes for early childhood education. They can be different for different kinds of retail. So you can have a tax rate for grocery stores, which have a very low kind of revenue, net revenue, and a very low rate for them. And you can have a very high tax on accountants and lawyers and other kinds of people who might have more disposable income. We put a tax on executive pay. So in San Francisco, if your average pay of your top executive is too many multiples over the average pay of your average employee, we put a surcharge on the business tax and charge you more because we believe that you're not running your company the right way. You can imagine this makes some people crazy, but the different business taxes in San Francisco raised $860 million just this last year from different business taxes. It's an incredibly large source of revenue if you have the appetite and your community has the appetite to do this kind of a tax. On property-related taxes, again, you can't change property tax rates in California. That's the basic Prop 13 discussion that everybody talks about, is not being able to move. But you can have a parcel tax that relates to property. And a parcel tax, it has to be a special tax. So it's going to have to be a 2/3 vote. And it can't be based on the property value, because that would make it too much like a property tax. But it can be based on a flat rate. Many of the ones school districts have are $45 for everybody, which businesses like because the little homeowner pays the same amount as the big Macy's store. But I mean, you can do that. You can do one on square footage. You can do it on the number of units. There are different ways to do it as long as you're not basing it on the value of the property. You can also
for just a minute, if you put it on by signature of the voters, it's only a majority vote.
Okay. You can also have a property transfer tax. Right now in California, the base property transfer tax is $1.10 for every $1,000 of assessed valuation of the purchase price. And that's split between cities and counties. So cities get 55 cents, counties get 55 cents. Counties can't change this tax, but charter cities can. And they can increase this tax quite a bit. On a parcel tax, the pros are a lot of them pass. And again, it can be progressive if you figure out different ways of going ahead and charging it. The cons are often, again, that single families pay the same amount as a large business. They tend to be mostly used for schools, and these tend to be much more popular in the Bay Area than in the rest of the state. But example, Pasadena has a $41 per parcel
No,
tax for the libraries.
I haven't. Let me see. Let me text her.
Sorry, we should mute if you're on there. Monterey tried to do a parcel tax of $49 for childcare, and that was defeated this last year. So win, some lose. On a property transfer tax, they can be quite progressive. One of the pros is that in any given year, very few people pay for it. So that means that you don't have the same level of opposition you often have. Realtors hate it, and they will typically oppose it because it makes it look like the person who's selling the house is not going to make as much money, which is probably true because they've had to pay more taxes. But again, there's all kinds of different ways you can do it. In San Francisco, we do a tax. If it's under $250,000 as a sales price, it's a very low tax. But if it's over $25 million, we take 6% of it. In Los Angeles, they just raised their tax from less than 0.5% to 4.5% for large parcels. And the money goes for homeless prevention and affordable housing. So you can make it go to certain kinds of things, and you can make it progressive if you do it. Richmond has a rate of 3% for anything over $10 million. So it's all over the map, and you can do it in a variety of ways. So it's pretty flexible.
Except
Yes.
it can't be a special tax. So what Richmond had to do was get it passed, and then they had to have another measure on the ballot, which ensured that the revenue, an advisory measure to put the new revenue into their youth fund.
Yeah. The next grouping are what I kind of say is transactional taxes. Sales tax, hotel tax, things that as you pay for something, we add a tax on it. So let me go through a couple of these. I'm going to go through sales tax, hotel and utility, cannabis tax, Jim is going to talk about in a few minutes, and parking tax and admission tax I won't talk as much about, but just briefly, again, a lot of cities don't charge for parking at all. So, if you're not charging for it, you can't tax it. But if in fact you are charging for parking, you can add a surcharge to that. And you can go ahead and say an extra 25 cents or an extra 10% or whatever of a parking tax will go for a certain kind of thing, or it just will go into the general coffers. I remember being in a meeting one time and I talked about the parking taxes in San Francisco, and most of the rest of the people almost passed out because they couldn't imagine charging people for parking in their community would have such a backlash. So again, it depends on what people are willing and able to do. An admissions tax tends to be a little bit smaller amount. But if you happen to have a pro or semi-pro team and you want to add a little bit of money on their tickets to pay for school sports, or you want to do something that people feel is a direct connection, those things are pretty easy to pass, actually, because you're already spending $25, $50, $100 for a ticket. You add a couple dollars to that and it goes for sports, and most people like to do that kind of thing. But again, it tends to be fairly specific for that kind of activity. So sales tax, that's the big one we always talk about. It applies to gross receipts from the sale of tangible personal property. So you go to the store, you buy something that's taxable, you pay your sales tax on it. The tax rate in California is 7.25% just to start with. And then voters can add up to 2% of a tax for a variety of purposes. Or if they go back to the state, they can get an exemption and go higher than that. So you'll see a lot of people in the state are over 10% now because they've gone back and gotten permission to have that exemption. The pros, it can raise a lot of money. It's a familiar tax. People understand it. They know what's going on with it. The cons are it is a regressive tax. Low-income people pay a disproportionate share of their income for a sales tax. So a lot of the people that we work with say that's just not a tax I want to touch because it just hurts poor people. We have tried to figure out ways to mitigate that. We haven't actually done this yet, but one of the thoughts that we had in an organization that I'm part of is if you could go ahead and raise the sales tax, but set aside 10%, whatever it might be of that tax, and add that back into a program for low-income people, like a food stamp program, or whatever program has the largest percentage of low-income people that benefit from that. If you could go ahead and take part of your sales tax money and add it as an additional benefit for food or an additional benefit for something else, that might mitigate some of that regressive nature of the tax. The other thing people talk about is that while this is a regressive tax, the kinds of things you do with it often are more helpful to low-income people. And so there's some mitigation there, but that's not a lot of folks have a problem with sales tax in any case. You'll see Alameda County is at 10.25%. Long Beach is 10.25%. LA is 9.5%. Then you get down to San Bernardino, San Diego counties, you're under 8%. So in theory, there is some room there. So in theory, if you're in San Diego County and the people around you are all higher, maybe there's room to do that, or maybe no one's going to vote for a sales tax in your area. So that's the polling, and that's the rest of it that you have to take into consideration. There's a wide variations in California. And around the country, you have sales taxes over 10% in some large places, and then you have states like Oregon where there's no sales tax at all. And so that's why if you're up on the upper border towards Oregon, you probably don't want to have a high sales tax. They'll just drive across the border to buy their goods in a different state. Hotel tax. These are levied on people that are staying for 30 days or fewer. We've had big fights with Airbnb, VRBO, and those. Most cities and counties have figured out ways to get around those problems. And in most cases, I think Airbnb is now being a pretty good player. The pros are people who vote probably won't pay it. So that's always a good thing because it's somebody else that's going to end up paying the tax. The cons are the Visitors Bureau typically votes or opposes it for being anti-competitive or anti-tourist. The comparisons, there's some fairly high ones and it bounces all over the map here. So San Diego has a variable rate. LA is about 14%, but Oakland is 14, Anaheim is 15. So again, you might want to look and see who your competitors are and whether you have a sales or a hotel tax that is a lot lower than somebody else and whether there's some room for that. Also, do you have enough hotels in your area that make it worthwhile to have this kind of a fight? If you don't have a lot of hotels, you're not going to make a lot of money on it. When you look this up, you will probably see it will say a transient occupancy tax when you look at any kind of reports from your government. They don't call it hotel tax, they call it TOT or transient occupancy tax. And the last one I wanted to talk about was the utility users tax. This is one that you can see only 4 counties in the state have it, but a whole lot of cities have it. And over half the state of California, the population is covered by places that have utility taxes. You can have these taxes on telephone, electricity, gas, all of them, none of them. You can have it on just residential customers or only commercial customers. San Francisco, the residential customers don't pay a utility users tax, but the commercial ones do. So you have a lot of ways of rearranging what's going on with that. And you can collect some decent money from that. Whoops. If you look at this Firebaugh, big old Firebaugh, 30% of their general fund revenues for their city come from a utility users tax. In Richmond, almost 30% comes from it. So this can be a sizable level of income coming in for your jurisdiction. It goes on to people's bills. They may or may not like it. The good news is they blame the phone company or PG&E or Southern Cal Edison and not you, because that's where they just say the bill went up again. We hate them, but I mean, but the money rolls in and they collect it for you, which is also a nice thing. But you can see in the group of people here, there's some cities you wouldn't necessarily expect, Porterville, Modesto, where they're getting over 15% of their total tax revenues are coming in from a utility users tax. So you might want to consider this as one of the taxes you look at. This is one that is not used as much, but it's a kind of a sub tax from utility users tax. We have this again in San Francisco, an access line tax, where we were trying to figure out how to tax people's phone bills differently. And so we added a tax that, depending on whether you're just an individual residential access line or whether you're a big trunk line because we wanted to get businesses taxed higher, or whether you have a high capacity line for a big business. And so we changed the amount we would charge depending on how big you were to make it a more kind of progressive tax. And again, last year we raised $55 million just from this access phone line tax. So there's ways to do it if you can kind of get creative about it. And again, I want to go back, leave us time to have enough time to talk about these things. So I'm going to stop there. And
Ed, you have a question which
I have a
probably is
question.
best to answer now. In California, can you restrict which goods sales tax applies to? Or maybe Ben knows the answer to this.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that.
Sure.
Good afternoon, everyone. Unfortunately, the sales tax is tiered and it's connected with the state sales tax. So you're going to be taxing the same exact stuff, the 7.5 sales taxes. So you can't really modify what's taxed and what isn't. It just goes on to every other good and that's taxed in California. So unfortunately the answer for that one is no.
Well, but the difference here is that if you do it statewide, you can change it. So for example, feminine products. If the state decided not to charge sales tax on feminine products, that would apply to everybody, including the local taxes.
Exactly.
We looked at this in other states too, where how do you define candy? Some states define candy as food and it's not taxed. Some states define candy as not food and it can be taxed. So as long as you can do it statewide, you can change the definition of what is taxable for the sales tax. Is that, am I missing something there, Ben, or is that?
No, that's exactly right. Thanks for the clarification there. I was mostly focusing on the local taxes, but right, at the state level, they can change it and that'll change what every item that's taxed.
Yep. And there's a big push for feminine products, for example, to not be taxed.
Okay, so we're going to go on to cannabis. And Jim, I don't know if you want to do a PowerPoint or not, but you are now a co-host.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Margaret. And thank you, Ed, for such a thorough presentation. I'm Jim Keddy with Youth Forward. I've been working on cannabis policy here in California since 2017. And I just have one slide. So I'm going to show my one slide. This is just a kind of big picture overview of Prop 64 on local governments. So local governments can pretty much do whatever they want when it comes to cannabis. They can ban or permit local businesses within their jurisdictions. And I think what I've been seeing gradually occur over time is more and more local cities and counties are passing ordinances to allow for legal cannabis businesses. And I think that trend will continue. They can allow only certain types of businesses to operate. So they can license dispensaries, for example, but not license cultivation. They can tax cannabis through passing local ballot measures. And I think we're going to continue to see the trend where if a local city or county chooses to allow for legal businesses, that city or county is also looking to collect revenue from those businesses. Typically, those taxes on businesses are gross receipts taxes. The local government can tax different types of businesses at different rates. And certainly in the cannabis industry, if you have competing sectors within the cannabis industry, it's not a monolithic industry. So you have people who do manufacturing, cannabis products, you have people who grow cannabis, you have all these different niches, labs. So those all can be taxed differently. Then local governments can do whatever they want with the revenue. So at the state level in Prop 64 included language that gave the state direction on how to spend cannabis tax revenue. And some of you are probably familiar with the Prop 64 grant programs. We've done a lot of work with state agencies to shape and develop those programs over the last several years. There's also a good chunk of money from Prop 64 that goes to childcare. But those kinds of buckets were written into Prop 64. They were fairly open-ended, but the state has some guidelines or some parameters, some boundaries on what it can do with cannabis revenue. Local government can do whatever it wants. And what we've been seeing pretty much across the board is local governments are putting those dollars into their general fund. And of course, when new revenue goes into a general fund, the biggest beneficiary of that new revenue would be the police department, since In cities, police departments make up the biggest budget, followed by fire, followed by other government services. And then another point I think that's important to know about local governments is they have the ability to regulate the industry. So many of us in the public health community, I'm sure many of you who are joining us today are aware of and are concerned about some of what's going on with cannabis. The cannabis industry is producing products that look like candy, that are soda, cookies that are very appealing to kids. The cannabis industry is also advertising to children and youth with images and language and methods that appeal to young people, meant to attract young people. The cannabis industry has significantly increased the amount of THC in cannabis products. And as you increase the amount of THC in cannabis, you increase the risk to people's mental health, particularly to younger people whose brains are still developing. There's more and more research coming out that shows the link between the use of potent cannabis products and mental illness among young people and young adults. There's also a lot of research now on the negative impact of cannabis use on unborn children, on fetal development with pregnant women. So the state and Prop 64, in my humble opinion, had very weak public health protections, a very weak warning label. But your local city can put in much stricter boundaries on what the industry can and can't do. Your local city can put a cap on the amount of THC in products being sold. Your local city can require a dispensary to have a much more visible and clearer warning sign so people learn about how to use cannabis safely and how to avoid some of the issues that we're seeing with cannabis use. But for the most part, local cities aren't paying a lot of attention to that. What they're really paying attention to is just how do we allow for legal businesses and how do we collect revenue to grow our general fund. We just released a report for LA County where we looked at 9 cities in LA, and working with Catalyst California, we did a budget analysis, and it essentially showed that those cities are collecting revenue, they're putting it in their general fund. A lot of those dollars are going to law enforcement, and that there's not much in the way of a racial or health equity point of view on how to spend those dollars. At Youth Forward, we have an opinion on all of this, and our point of view is that given the fact that cannabis and marijuana policy sent Black and brown people to prison for decades, that the state and local governments should use cannabis revenue to support health and healing in communities that were impacted by the war on drugs. We also feel strongly that cannabis revenue, similar to tobacco tax revenue, should be also invested in youth substance use prevention and youth development to address issues around addiction and the harms of using the substance. So kind of a similar to a tobacco model there. Although I do want to say though that the voting public, I think, is still there's still a strong view among many people, certainly among policymakers, that cannabis is largely harmless. And so the argument we make around tobacco moves some people or makes sense to some people, but doesn't make sense to other people. I do think that's going to gradually shift as you have, kids showing up at an elementary school with a bag of edibles that they took to the school that looks like Skittles candy, and they hand them out. And now you've got a crisis at the school with kids passing out in class, and so that sort of thing is going on, and I think we're going to see more of it. So that was kind of a big picture overview. Then let me just talk briefly. Here in Sacramento, we did win a ballot measure in November. Measure L, and Measure L requires the city to set aside the equivalent of 40% of its cannabis revenue for child and youth services, with a priority given to children most impacted by poverty, violence, and trauma. We did win with 62% of the vote. It is a set aside, so it was a simple majority vote. That language of the equivalent of 40% of cannabis revenue was really key to us keeping it as a simple majority vote. And Claudia, who's on the call with us, could answer more questions in detail if you have any of those, since she worked very closely with the city attorney in helping us put the language together. We do have a robust cannabis industry here in the city. The city, until recently, was collecting around $25 million a year from cannabis. That's dipped a little bit. I'll tell you right now, the cannabis industry is kind of going through some turbulence. There's a lot of overproduction of cannabis in the state. We're growing too much weed, and that's driving the price down, making it harder for cannabis industries to be profitable. During the pandemic, the cannabis industry definitely boomed. And people in the industry will tell you that's because when the federal government sent out those stimulus payments, a good number of people took that stimulus payment and went down to the local dispensary. And people were home, so what are you going to do? I don't know.
Jimmy, you have 3 questions. I don't know if you
do,
want to
okay.
address them now. So one is the difference between what cities and counties can do related to the both the tax and the regulation is one. Then is there a way to use cannabis tax for education? And then there is a comment from Humboldt where the cannabis growers are struggling and they want to know does that look the same around the state? Did you follow that?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. Let me just finish my thought though, Margaret.
Okay,
So I mentioned that the cannabis industry is going through a fair amount of turbulence right now. I do want to lift up though that I do think this is a long-term revenue stream. And when you look at major investors and major industries moving into the market, certainly the tobacco industry is behind the scenes moving into the market. The alcohol industry, not just in California, but nationally in Canada. I do think we are looking at a long-term revenue stream here that while we're experiencing turbulence now, I do think it will continue to grow. And, the cannabis industry is sort of like the soda industry or these other industries where they want it to be just kind of part of a normal part of life. And given the power of advertising and all the stuff we see in a capitalist society, don't get me started. I think that's what we're going to be seeing. There's a question about Humboldt. With cannabis industry struggling to stay afloat up there. So Prop 64 had language in the measure that was meant to not allow for kind of big corporate cultivation businesses for a certain period of time. And that was designed to protect the smaller farmers and the folks in Humboldt who've been part of this industry for a very long time. Unfortunately, in regulation, the Bureau of Cannabis Control took out that protection for smaller growers. So now the folks up in Humboldt and the Emerald Triangle have to compete with massive corporate grows in Coachella Valley and Santa Barbara and other places. And there's just kind of general overproduction. So that is definitely going on and will probably continue to go on. The question about cities and counties, cannabis regulation and taxes. So counties can also allow for cannabis businesses in unincorporated areas, and they can tax those businesses. Just this week, Supervisor Solis in Los Angeles County passed a motion with the Board of Supervisors related to how they intend to use their cannabis tax revenue at the county level. And fortunately, the County Board of Supervisors is having the conversation around using those new revenues for a positive purpose and for community reinvestment in kids, and not just to have it disappear into the LA County General Fund. And then the last one is to use a cannabis tax for education funds. Well, certainly, I would think a local city could use cannabis revenues to fund supports for local schools, whether that be after school or other ways in early childhood, other functions that support the education mission. I don't believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, I don't believe a local city could transfer funds to a school district. And certainly a school district couldn't tax cannabis on its own. Is that correct, Ed?
You know, we transfer funds to the school district all the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we're a city and a county, so I think Ben has a different opinion about that.
Yeah, San Francisco does, the county as and it acts as a charter city, provides school money to its schools. It's unclear if general law cities and counties can do the same thing, but we have seen some examples of that. But Jim, you're right, school districts can't levy cannabis taxes, only cities and counties.
Okay, I think that was everything I wanted to cover, Margaret. I don't know if there's any
So
other
let
questions.
me ask Ben, because he's our legal expert sitting here, if there's anything we've said that is wrong or needs to be corrected or added to, and then we're up for a free-for-all here, guys. So if people start thinking, I'm trying to think, how do you conduct a free-for-all? But if you want to ask a question, put your name in the chat. I don't have this hand-raising capacity on my computer for some reason. Or, well, I guess you can do it with reactions. Can you? Yeah, you can
can
put
raise your hand with
up.
reaction.
Yeah, you can put your hand up for reactions. So first, let me call on Ben to see if he has anything we've said that's wrong or that needs to be added to it, and then use the reactions thing and put up your hand.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't think anything you guys said was wrong. I thought that was really helpful. I think, I want to add a little bit of the legal context, Ed was talking about the sweet spot of the needs, political reality, and the capacity. Another piece of that is the legal constraints. And unfortunately, California's constitution has been set up to make it hard for local governments and voters to raise revenue that they need to raise. So that, that makes us run into these legal constraints sometimes. And that's what we're around to help with. There was one big thing that we haven't mentioned yet, and that's what's coming up on the statewide ballot or potentially coming up. A lot of business groups have helped qualify a statewide measure that is qualified for the 2024 ballot. It's not clear if it's going to go on the ballot yet, but it would really hamper the local government and the state's ability to raise additional revenue. I think the name of the ballot measure, it's got a not very nice name. It's the Taxpayer Protection and Government Accountability Act initiative. And one of the big things that it does that I've been paying attention to is it would reverse this new recent rule that says a voter special tax initiative requires a simple majority vote, and they want to reverse that. And they also want to make it retroactive. So if, say we passed a special tax in one of your jurisdictions and next March's primary election, that would have to go back to the ballot and get a 2/3 vote. So I think we've been studying this measure. I think it's pretty concerning, and it's something that everyone should be aware of going into the election. I mean, it might not make it to the ballot. There was a similar measure in 2018, and they pretty much held the state hostage until they banned soda taxes, and then they withdrew the measure. So they could be doing that. And this also could be subject to legal challenges. Statewide ballot measures get pulled off the ballot all the time because they're unconstitutional. So that's just something to be aware of that's coming up in the next.
And it's possible it wouldn't pass, or entirely.
Of course,
possible.
yes.
The
And I won't be voting for it.
The opposition is overwhelming. So what we are advising people based on the opinion of James from your law firm and our pollster is people should go ahead with what they feel they want to do, and we will see what happens. But there are so many ways that this won't end up, working against us that we are advising people to move forward, just by the way, but knowing it's out there
Absolutely.
it is important. So
Yeah.
Frankie, I see your hand.
Yes, hi. Thank you for all this information. I have two questions that are not related, but the topic has come up today. One is, if you go the ballot measure way of doing a set aside a certain percent at the county, which is what Courage is trying to do in Alameda County, do you build into that ballot measure the creation of the fund or the infrastructure for then what you do with that pot of money? That's question one. The other question is around the poll that you're going to do that you said would, give us some information and be helpful to us across the state. Wondering when we can learn more about what's going to be on that poll, and just to what extent will it help us in the individual localities, and what kind of like supplemental polling we might need to do in our own local context. Thanks.
We're trying to get as much in that poll as possible, and it won't be like, here's what you can do in Alameda County. It'll be, here's what you can do in the Bay Area. Here's what you can do in the Central Valley. So it will break the state up geographically, not specific by city or county. And I don't know how to, I haven't seen the latest draft yet, but we are asking people what they think of all these what their priorities for kids are, what they think of the ballot measures, what are the revenue options, what they think of various arguments, who they think the best messengers are, those kinds of things. And if you're interested, Frankie, I can send you a copy of a draft, and if you have some other ideas, or if anybody's interested, put it in the chat.
Frankie also asked about the
Yeah, so I wanted to answer that question because some people put in their measure, and this creates an office for children, youth, and their families, which will be, the people who put the whole infrastructure in there. And the advantage of that is you don't have a fight like they're having in Sacramento about, well, should we have a fund now? Should we have a separate office or not? Or should it just fall under the auspices of the Rec and Park Department? Or so there's the disadvantage of putting it all in is, you just want to create more bureaucracy. The advantage is you really spell out, yes, we're going to create a department, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of a balance, and people have done it different ways. I personally think it works to put it in there, but not. It does give an argument against it. Ed, yeah.
Just to add to that, there are things you can put in those that help the ballot. For example, people like to see that things are going to be audited. So putting in an audit requirement. People like to see that only a certain percentage will go for overhead or administration versus direct services. So adding some of those kind of things in it that don't tie your hands too much can also help with your campaign.
Jim, you have your hand raised, or do you? Jim Keddy?
Yeah, hi. So I just wanted to clarify with Ben. So is how are the business roundtables statewide ballot measure that would require 2/3 vote on everything? Is that still circulating, or have they actually turned in the signatures already?
Yeah, they've turned in the signatures and they've gotten approval. They've got enough signatures to qualify for the ballot. So they still have until like 131 days before the election to withdraw it or not. So they've qualified for the ballot, and if they wanted to move forward, it would be on the 2024 ballot.
Okay. So the question is will it survive a legal challenge, and two, are they using it as a leverage for something else they want?
Yeah, or as Margaret said, if voters have the appetite for it, which
right, got it. Yeah, okay.
I hope they don't. I don't think they do, but I'm not a pollster or a political strategist.
Yeah.
Our pollster has advised us to tell people to move forward.
Just
FYI. Claudia.
Yeah, I want to make sure I understood something that was said around the sales tax. I understand that there's a state rate that has been set. My clarifying question is about a potential local increase to that tax, and if that could be directed to certain goods and services, for example, luxury goods.
Yeah, because the local sales tax has to model the state sales tax, it has to look exactly the same. So you can't make it specific for certain goods and services.
Okay.
Just goods.
Thank you.
But it can be a special tax.
That's right. You could
which
direct
is what they did in Alameda. They raised the sales tax, and it's for childcare.
Well, and almost everybody has a sales tax for transportation, for example. It's very common.
Okay, come on, guys. Think about what you're trying to do and what your questions are. Like, I know every place is different, but this is where you will never have this kind of brain trust. Again, Parker.
Hi, Margaret. Thank you. My apologies. losing my voice a little. Parker Blackman with the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment. Ed, I really appreciate your overview on the different kinds of taxes or revenue generation options and the pros and cons. My question to you and to others is how you think about the sequencing, meaning how do you evaluate which option might be best for you, knowing how much money you might need to raise for, let's say, a child care fund, and then the political feasibility of that. So, in the abstract, X versus Y is fine, but if you need to raise $400 million in LA County, which of those taxes is most likely to actually help you generate that kind of revenue? And then at what level? Meaning, if you just use a parcel tax as an example, how high of a dollar amount do you need to levy per parcel to get to a certain, at least, range? And then I'm assuming you want to figure that out and then go test that with your polling, because you need to understand not just if people are open to a parcel tax for childcare, but if they're willing to pay X in support of that. Is that right? Or how do you think about the kind of the sequencing of those three things?
And
Yeah,
why don't
and-
you answer? Because my answer will be different. I'm
Yeah,
sure.
feel free to jump in. But so I think the first thing to start with is what's the range of money you want? Because that allows you to throw some of the taxes out right away. They're just not gonna be enough money to do what you're trying to do. Then the second thing I do is I look at the budget for the county or the city and see what taxes are there right now and what taxes are big enough to kind of be thinking about, and which ones are available. So the big one is going to be property taxes, but you can't do much with that. And so then trying to figure out, okay, based on how much money I want, here's several taxes that might work. Then you can start seeing, okay, are they scalable or not? Are they something that I can direct at businesses versus residences? What's kind of the flexibility to make it move? And then you have to start playing it around. So sometimes you will need to get information. For example, if you want to do a parcel tax, you need to get some information from your assessor about how many parcels are there, and do they have information about the size of the parcel, for example, or something. There's one place that I think did a parcel tax based on the linear footage of the street. Well, you can only do that if your county has the information or your city has the information to do it. So part of it is the information even out there to be able to assess this tax and do it? If you don't have a business registration fee, it's hard to have a business tax because you have no idea who's out there. So part of it is, what's available, practically speaking. And then you're right. Then you say, okay, to make enough money, we would need a $500 per parcel tax. Is that even possible? Or could we do a $50 one for residential, $35 for multifamily, and something else for a different kind of thing? So it's going to be iterative. It's going to be going back and forth saying, is this enough money? Is this too high a tax? And bouncing it among you and your
Hello?
first
Julia,
before you start polling.
Yes,
how you doing?
Margaret, what do
I'm
you-
doing good. How you doing?
Could somebody,
I'm so sorry. I didn't know you called me back. I
uh,
had
Oh, that's
somebody
all
mute,
right.
we need somebody to mute.
Gloria, I need to bring to Gloria's dress.
Can mute her as the
So,
host.
if I send you,
Gloria,
Gloria, can you mute?
so
Oh, good.
So yeah, Margaret, what do you think?
No, all I was saying is it's not necessarily a sequential thing that you have to do multiple things at once. And you can poll for like 3 or 4 different things, and 3 or 4 different amounts, and they ended up on $49 parcel tax because that in Monterey, because they polled for all, different levels of parcel tax and other things. So I can't do better than you, Ed, on anything. So I just want to say if you want to get away from thinking about multiple things at once, you probably don't want to do this because you really do have to. Okay.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Does anybody, come on, guys, what are you thinking about?
I have a question for Jim.
Okay.
That's okay. Jim, could you briefly touch on kind of the national context around cannabis, just so folks are aware of what might be coming down the pipe and may not necessarily have an impact, but I think more information is better?
Yeah. And so what I see in the national picture is that gradually state after state is moving towards legal cannabis. Certainly, the vast majority of states already allow for medical use, but more and more are allowing for recreational use. And down the road, I think we can anticipate that the federal government will take cannabis off the Schedule 1 list. So that's where the federal government categorizes cannabis as being as dangerous a drug as like heroin or something like that. And then at some point, the federal government, I expect, will also allow for the cannabis industry to use the regular banking system. And that, as well as making some changes to the way the federal government treats cannabis businesses, will make the entire industry much more profitable than it is today. And I think that is on the horizon, and it's just a matter of time. I'm kind of surprised, frankly, that it hasn't happened yet in the Biden administration, but it's on the horizon for sure.
And do you think, as part of that work, that those changes, there will be a federal tax imposed?
Could be. It's in the realm of possibility.
So I guess what I want to know is what more do people need to know or want to know or think about in order to sort of figure out what the options are in your city or county? You could put it you can raise your hand or put it in the chat, because I'm trying to figure out what our next step is in helping you. And it might be, you want Ed to look at your budget. And I offer that to too many people. But if you want that, to sort of look at the budget of your city or county and say, you're really overtaxing this, but some of the things you could tax are, or here's why a set aside might work. Who are the budget consultants who can support this work? Well, Ed is our budget consultant, but you might suggest, Ed, other people they could go to. And I do strongly suggest that you can sit down with your, city or county fiscal controller or fiscal budget director or whoever, and they can give you all kinds of information specific to your city and county.
Yeah, especially county auditor controllers in most counties are elected officials. They should want to make you happy. But even when they're not elected, the people work for you. That's what their job is to try to make sure things are going right. And there's a whole program right now of the Government Finance Officers Association. And most of your city and county finance people are going to be members of GFOA. And they have a whole thing about budget transparency and about making the budget available to people and making the information available. And so, I would definitely get to have a relationship with someone there if you can, because as Margaret said, even if they don't like what you're doing, when Margaret put this on the San Francisco ballot, I opposed it because the set aside was going to reduce flexibility. So people change over time too. But yeah, I would start with them too. But I'm happy to help.
Sarah.
Hi there. Thank you all for having this. This has been really helpful. I'm calling from Marin. We have Marin Promise Partnership, and I'm curious. Here we have a huge discrepancy between those that have, areas in Marin that are very wealthy and don't need these funds, and other areas of Marin that really could use these funds. Is there a way in any of these tax revenue sources or set asides that are able to be set aside for certain areas? Like, how would we write something up so that, for Marin, it could be set aside for Sausalito, Marin City, Novato, San Rafael Canal District, and West Marin, for example, rather than other areas that may not need the funds as much?
So I would not recommend that. I don't even know if it's legal or not, what you can set it aside for low income children. You can set it aside, you can describe who you want to serve and set it aside for them. I'm not sure, Ben, if you can set it aside for a specific geographic area, but I'm thinking politically that is not a good thing to do, because every place has some kids who need it. You could set it aside for by income. You could set it aside also for children with disabilities, or other kinds of disadvantages that you want to address, and that would be the way I personally would do it. Ben?
And I agree. I think legally it's not clear that you could send it to certain jurisdictions if you're going countywide, but if you do it by categories, by certain income brackets, or some of the categories that Margaret was saying, I think that would be a lot easier to draft as well and would avoid those legal problems.
Oh,
A follow-up clarifying question then, Ben. So if a county can tax the cannabis industry in unincorporated areas, can the money be spent anywhere in the county or only in where it was gathered?
That's a good question. I've worked on some general cannabis taxes in a county where the county imposes the tax in the unincorporated area and it goes to the general fund. And of course, that general fund's being spent across the county. So I think it'd probably be the same thing for a special tax. You can do special taxes with cannabis on cannabis. I've never worked on any that have. Mostly it's been general taxes because they've been imposed by the local government. But yeah, I believe you could.
Yeah, I worked on San Joaquin County, tried this twice. It came so close to passing. I cry when I think about it, but it was taxing cannabis in unincorporated areas, because that's where a lot of it was being grown. That's where, most of the industry was actually, and their intent was absolutely spend it in Stockton, spend it on, needy kids throughout the county, and nobody said that wasn't legal, so I assume it was. So, September, what are you saying? Truth?
That Ed opposed the set aside originally. I was around for that chapter. That's all. People change. We all do.
But even though I didn't like it, we sat down with Margaret and her folks repeatedly to make it work.
Yes.
And to implement it well. Very
Yeah.
true.
Yeah. Yes. So, did this stimulate people's thinking? Do you have other questions? Is it overwhelming? Did somebody get an idea? All of the above. Yes. Okay. I just want to repeat that you will rarely get as knowledgeable a group of people together again about this. So no question is too specific or too small to say. For instance, we had a discussion, Claudia and I, with people from Coachella Valley, and it was very specific. Like it's not a charter city, and most of the kids are in an unincorporated area. And so the challenge was enormous, and we started, okay, maybe this is where the school district puts something on the ballot, because that will serve the kids that we need. And that's where I just started adding that to the list. Realize that there are some places what will have to rely on a school district. Parker.
I'll preface this by saying I should probably take your advice and talk to the Auditor Controller's Office in LA County. But if you happen to know, my understanding is that LA County is up against its current limit on sales tax, but that there is a 1/4 cent sales tax that is due to expire. And that if it expires and they don't renew it around funding it's around housing, affordable housing and homelessness, that if they don't renew it, then there's going to be a 1/4 cent sales tax that's available. And then it might be a free-for-all for that, but that I just wonder if you, Margaret, Ed, Ben, have any, or anyone else have an update or better understanding of that situation.
Do you, Ed?
I don't. I know that LA County has really high sales tax, so I think it's right that it's bumping up. Just a side point from that, I think Sonoma's looking at a sales tax, And there are some cities within Sonoma that have bumped up against it, but not the whole county. So that's when you also have to realize if you go and do it for the whole county, it might not be imposed in Cotati, for example, because they're already up to the limit. So there's some issues with that. But in LA, I think you're so many are up at the top, you're going to have something go down before you can go back up. But go ahead, Ben.
And Parker, I'd have to look at the exact, there's a website that shows when all the taxes expire, but if it does expire, you would be able, and there's a quarter-cent left, you would be able to go in and you could do a special tax and re-up that quarter-cent and earmark it. But then, as Ed was saying, there are some of these cities and counties where some cities are above the rate, but the county is not above the sales tax rate. And that gets a little more complicated because you're not going to be able to impose the sales tax across the entire jurisdiction. And that means you're going to get a little less revenue than if there was more room. And you can always, doesn't sound that easy, but you can go to the legislature and they provide a lot of sales tax exemptions where they'll let you raise it above this 2% rate. And they do that, every couple of years for lots of jurisdictions.
Leslie had a question. Where's the best place to go for more information on a utility user tax?
Thank you, Claudia, because I was just starting to type it in. It's easier to say it. So, as dumb as it may sound, the first place I go is just Googling California utility users tax. It tells you who has one, who doesn't, how much they charge. There's a lot of information about utility users taxes. And then I would go, if you're interested in more, I would go to the budget you're looking at for the city or county and see if you already impose one and how much it's collecting. And some cities, or especially counties, if you have a tax collector, usually on their website, it'll give you the rates. So it'll say, here we have utility users tax of 6%. It's imposed on just phone or just garbage or just water and power. It'll tell you a lot of information about things like that. And I would start there.
Thank you very much.
I do want to say we're writing a little booklet now on all the, Oakland has passed, well, one was a county, but four were Oakland, 4 different taxes that benefit children and youth services. And I will make sure everybody here gets it, but there's probably nothing they haven't tried, including the parking garage, which was used for violence prevention. And parcel taxes and sales taxes and set-asides. And so just to say this can have a cumulative effect, and one kind of revenue doesn't have to be the total answer. And no one's done more than San Francisco, just because we like taxes. Or we will pass taxes. Any other comments, thoughts, questions about your particular community? I see our San Bernardino friends are here. Claudia, I don't know if you're still here, but you mentioned, Jim, that was where a lot of cannabis is happening. I don't know if you're still there, Jim, and whether you have any advice for San Bernardino.
Well, there's definitely a lot of cannabis being grown in the Coachella Valley, which I believe is Riverside County, but
Riverside, yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And actually the one, Claudia, who's on the line here, is also representing Riverside.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They are considering that. I don't know if you have any advice for them.
Oh, happy to connect offline for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Which gets to probably our final point, which is